It's the 14th of April and it's a Monday morning. And if you've joined us, then you are on the Fifth Connection, the channel that talks you through the storyline of what stick to itiveness looks like. What does it mean to stick with Jesus? We continue right along this morning in chapter 11 of the story, and we pick up in verse number 20. Because the writer is tracking the honor roll of faith. Examples now of those who learned what it meant to stick with Jesus, to hold on to Him, to believe in Him. 5 times across the book of Hebrews, and in 5 different warnings as well. In addition to the 5 times he challenges these Christian Hebrews not to throw away their confidence in Christ, but rather to continue to hold on to their confession. So 5 distinct times he does that, as well as through 5 warnings, what we call the warning passages, challenging us to hold on to Christ, hold on to the confession of your faith. And that is so important because the singular sin that will sever you from holding on is unbelief. And he talks now through chapter 11, which is commonly called the chapter of faith, tracking numerous examples all the way from before the flood. And now we are up to the point in verse number 20, where he's going to talk about 3 men, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And he's going to show how these 3 clung to the promises of God. God had promised something, and they were clinging and holding on to that promise. In the case of Isaac, verse 20 says, very briefly, by faith Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. It was by faith that he blessed these 2 boys with respect to their future. And of course, even though Esau was the firstborn, the blessing falls to Jacob. And then secondarily, a blessing falls onto Esau. And then the writer goes on to Jacob and says, by faith, Jacob, when dying, he was on his deathbed, he blessed each of the sons of Joseph. Joseph had 12 sons. There was one daughter in there, Dinah, but the 12 sons each receive blessing from him. And bowing down in worship over the head of his staff. So he was quite old when he did that. By faith, Jacob, while dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and bowed in worship while leaning on his staff. Then verse 22, Joseph, by faith Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. You will remember how that Joseph is the one who's sold into slavery in Egypt, into the house of Potiphar. And of course, he's in prison because of a false accusation, even though he rises to number 2 in the kingdom. But he's betrayed. And yet even after coming out of prison, he does great endeavors for God. But he makes mention at the end of his life that after he dies and the family moves back to the land of promise, that they take his bones with them. So at the end of his life, he makes mention of the departure of the Israelites from Egyptian captivity 430 years after they come into the land. That's Egypt. And he gives instruction concerning the burial of his bones. And so, three distinct people who, because of their continuity of contact with the one for whom they ultimately care, and of course, he's God. Because you see, that's what faith is, continuity of contact for the ultimate one. And they hold on to the promises that this one has made. God in Genesis 12 promises Abram three things. He promises him a land, descendants, and blessing. And that's the thing in Genesis 12, verses 1, 2, and 3, that not only carries Abram through his great challenge, through his migration from Ur of the Chaldees and journeying into the land which was then under Canaanite rule. And of course, as a migrant, he walks through the land, clinging to the promises. And so do his offspring, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And yet, in their endeavors, they are not perfect. Isaac is, by a long shot, not perfect because there was favoritism. Rebecca had a favorite, right? And so did Isaac. Jacob, his record wasn't perfect either. But the one thing that these three had in common was their faith, because faith is not a work. Faith is not dependent on something you do. It is based upon your continuity of contact with the one for whom you ultimately care. Now, when we talk about faith, our mind, we are so Luciferian, left hemispheric in our response that our minds constantly gravitate to propositions, statements that we believe, statements of belief. That's not what is in view here. There's no confession, statement of faith. There's no Westminster Confession. There's no Belgic Confession. Any of the Helvetic confessions are not in here. There's no creeds in here. This is what we would call raw faith. There is faithfulness, there is reliability, and there is trust. And these things are embodied because faith is embodied. It's something that happens inside of you. It's not something that's outside of you that has black ink on white paper. It is the embodiment of reliability, faithfulness, and trust in the one for whom you ultimately care. And that's what these boys show, these men, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And so the question we left off with in the last episode was, what impact does human migration? In the case of Abram, he was a nomad when he left Ur of the Chaldees. What is the birth of a child? How did that stretch Sarah? These individuals were past their sell-by date. Sarah in particular. And of course, for 25 years, they wait for God's promise to come true, miraculously come true. So there's migration, there's conception, there's even suspension of citizenship. Because it is said of these men, when they come into the land of promise, they are still looking for something else beyond the land that they are in, which God promised, incidentally. But the writer in Hebrews talks about a heavenly habitation, a city that they were looking for. And then, of course, there's the sacrifice of a son. Abram offers Isaac and stops short of killing him. Very, very interesting discussion in the book of Genesis about that. So there's migration, there's conception, there's suspension of citizenship, and there's termination, near termination of the life of a child. And the question was, what impact do these things have on the human psyche when we are faced with great challenge, almost insurmountable crises, when life crashes in on us, when we don't have answers? What impact does that have on us? We either lose it, we either defect, because that moment of crisis in our minds is just too much to bear. Well, so far in these 22 verses that we've been walking through of the storyline of what faith looks like, we see that each time, once it's embodied, it issues into an external expression. It issues into something that is tangible, something that gets done. But that is based upon an internal resolve, continuity of contact with the one for whom you ultimately care. And he is none other than the object of our faith, God himself. And of course, Jesus becomes the exact representation, the apagasma of God, the reflection of the very character and person, as we would say, of God. And so, what are you facing this morning that is bringing great consternation in your life? A lot of heat is being generated, a lot of consternation, confusion, doubts, questions. See, don't confuse questions and doubt with the sin of unbelief. They are two different things. It's one thing to doubt, it's another thing to defect and to say, I don't believe in Jesus any longer. Because that's what a defector does. Oh, I used to believe, but I don't believe anymore in the person of Christ. If that happens, there is no sacrifice for sins. Nothing else could atone or would atone for sin. And when you look to the 5 warnings across the book, you see an increasing intensity from one warning to another in terms of the severity of what would happen and what happens when one ultimately defects. And what's that defection about? It's called unbelief. Faith is not a work. Faith is a posture of the human heart in relation to God. Continuity of contact that is embodied. It takes up residence in a person. It's not this ethereal thing, this ephemeral thing, like a mist. It's something that is real. Is that the reality you live inside of? I would think that that makes for some very exciting living, because when we run out of answers and all we have is questions, all we have are questions, and the only thing we can do is to hold on to the Lord. He's the one who is the superordinate Son, the superordinate walk. And in chapter 11, 12, and 13, he's the superordinate way. In what ways do you need to hold on to him this morning? Maybe your job is in jeopardy. Your life is in jeopardy because of your health. Your mind is not as sharp as it used to be. Can't get there fast enough. Can't get up quickly enough. Can't think with great precision and speed. And those are all very humbling things for us as we face growing older. But God. And so as you go with God this morning, be encouraged. He's still on the throne. He has not abdicated. And he's the one who is looking out for you. Trust you will have a good day as you go with God. Goodbye for now.